Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. It's great to have you with us today as we talk about this new resource from Mentor and our good friends at Partners for Youth with Disabilities. My name is Mike Geringer. I am the Director of Research and Evaluation at Mentor, and I use he, him pronouns. I'm a white guy with a beard sitting in my living room wearing a black t-shirt with our mantle and our fireplace behind me. I'll turn it over to my colleagues from PYD here in a moment to introduce themselves, but really just wanted to welcome everybody to this event. We're going to be talking about a very cool new resource today, and we're just excited to have you with us. Have a good conversation about how we can make sure that our mentoring programs are inclusive of young people with disabilities. So a lot of good content today, and then in the wake of this, a new resource that you all can use in your work. So I already introduced myself, but I want to give my colleagues from PYD a chance to introduce themselves as well, and then we'll cover a little bit of housekeeping stuff here. I will explain a little bit of kind of the background of this project and what the resource that we're talking about today is all about and kind of why we created it. And then the folks from PYD are really going to walk everyone through the content of this resource and talk a little bit about how it can be used by mentoring programs and the many, many ways in which we recommend that programs can kind of improve their inclusivity for young people with disabilities. So Janelle, do you want to start us off and introduce yourself to the audience here today?
I sure can. Hi, everybody. I'm Janelle Thomas. I am the Director of National Initiatives at Partners for Youth with Disabilities. You'll hear us call ourselves PYD. That stands for Partners for Youth with Disabilities. I am a woman with a chronic health condition, so I'll be speaking both professionally and personally as I discuss the guide. I use the She series, and I'm a middle-aged woman with blonde hair wearing a blue shirt and a black necklace and some blue artwork behind me. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to spending the next hour with you. I'm going to pass it on to Jordy Loam.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Janelle. Hello, everyone. My name is Jordan or Jordy Loam, and I am the Match Support Program Manager at Partners for Youth with Disabilities as well. I am an average size person with auburn hair, glasses, currently in my living room and wearing a pink blouse. I'm really excited to be here. I'm also coming to this experience not just as someone that's worked in the professional mentoring field for 5 years, but also as an autistic non-binary person, which, while provides me some insight, I know often is not the often shared experience. And so one of the things I found really helpful about this project, as well as meeting the people in this advisory, was just being able to include as many different voices and experiences to really provide a more concise headlines, but not necessarily details about how we can improve with mentoring, and really hope that we can break these experiences down in this webinar. So I'll next pass it over to Kristen.
Thank you. And hi, everyone. I'm Kristen Humphrey. I am the National Disability Mentoring Coalition Director, which is an initiative of Partners for Youth with Disabilities. I am a white woman with auburn hair wearing a black blazer, and really thrilled to be here with you all today.
Great, thank you so much. So welcome everybody. We've got a lot of content to get through here, so I'll kind of get through some of this housekeeping quickly so that we can move on to kind of the content of this new resource and answering questions that you have. So for the housekeeping, obviously we are recording today's session, so if you want to share this with other colleagues or folks that couldn't make it today, that will be available after our session. We are going to keep the audio muted just for recording quality, but we really hope that all of you ask questions along the way. We'll stop at kind of the midpoint of our hour together here today to see if there are any questions in there. Use the Q&A feature in the little Zoom navigation bar, whatever you call that these days. So go ahead and put any questions in there. We'll pause at a couple points midway and then at the end to make sure that we're getting to folks' questions. After this event, people always ask, can I get a copy of the slides? Can I get a link to the recording? Yes, we will send all of that out. But I also want to let our audience know that the new resource that we are going to be talking about today is up and available on the Mentor website as of this morning. It's available to download as a PDF. There's kind of a full version that's got all of our recommendations. There's also kind of a checklist version that's about 5 or 6 pages that really just kind of hits the key highlights of recommendations. You could use that as almost a little bit of a self-assessment tool to see where you're at as an organization. The URL for that is here at the bottom of the screen, but certainly feel free to check it out while we're talking or when we wrap up here in an hour. So I want to just explain a few basics about this publication so that folks know what they're going to get when they hit that download link. So the full title is Mentoring, Inclusive Mentoring for Youth with Disabilities, and it is built as a supplement to the elements of effective practice. So those of you that follow the work of Mentor know that we have, for 3 decades now, had our elements of effective practice, which is kind of our main guide on how to run a quality volunteer mentoring program for young people. But obviously there is no one set of advice that is perfect across every program. There are nuances to doing this work. And so we have done this series of kind of supplementary publications that either talk about how to run a specific type of program model or maybe work with a certain group of young people. Certainly this is a supplement that applies, I think, to every mentoring program, and we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go on. But this is our 8th in this series of kind of supplementary publications to that main elements of effective practice. This project started back a few years ago as part of a larger partnership agreement and body of work between Mentor and PYD, and that involved all kinds of good work, some advocacy work, trying to get Congress to invest more in mentoring services for young people with disabilities. We did a bunch of training for programs, and certainly there's more of that planned, and we'll talk about that towards the end of this our time today. And then this publication, we wanted to produce a resource that would really help mentoring programs improve their inclusive practice around disability issues. I want to give a big thanks to our supporters at Altria for their investment in this important work. They really understand the value of all of this work and the need to make sure that our mentoring services are bringing in all kinds of diverse folks, but certainly folks with disability, I think, often get lost in that kind of diversity and inclusion shuffle, unfortunately. And so we wanted to really put a stake in the ground with this product and say this is important for our field. Every mentoring program needs to be improving how they welcome in volunteers, young people, families, staff with disabilities. We really wanted to lean on the expertise of our partners here at PYD. They've got a long history of running mentoring programs, advocating for all kinds of disability issues. And so we certainly wanted to draw on their deep expertise. We also pulled together, though, a really great working group of expert practitioners and other scholars. And so, Jordy, thank you for mentioning kind of the many and diverse voices that contributed to this publication. Our goals here were really kind of twofold. One was to provide guidance for every mentoring program on how they can examine and improve the inclusiveness of their services with a specific lens on disability here. There are young people with disabilities in every single mentoring program in the United States, without question. But a lot of programs don't know that or don't know the extent to which they are serving folks with disabilities. And so we wanted to provide general guidance that we think applies to all programs and things that they can do to strengthen this. There are mentoring programs out there, and PYD runs some of them. Jordy, your work directly is this, that are really tailored to the specific needs and circumstances and growth of young people with disabilities. And so we do provide some advice in here for programs that exclusively serve young people with disabilities, highlighting some things that they may want to emphasize in their work. But most of the advice here is kind of for everybody that works in this space. We certainly build off of kind of the structure of the elements of effective practice, if you're familiar with that publication. But here we wanted to go more in depth around kind of the importance of leadership buy-in and changing program policy. A lot of the elements of effective practice is about how to run day-to-day operations and recruit volunteers and match them. And we do talk about that, and Jordy will be covering those suggestions later in the presentation here. But we wanted to talk more about kind of the commitment that it takes to really run an inclusive mentoring program. And so we talk a lot about kind of leadership and really changing policy and practice at a deeper level than we often do in these publications. We also included a little bit around if you're going to be evaluating your program, there's some ways that you can make evaluation more inclusive as well. I mentioned that working group of amazing practitioners and scholars. These are the folks that helped us with that. I won't mention everybody here, but we've got folks that lead really, top of the line mentoring programs. We've got Sophia from one of our affiliates in the Pittsburgh area from Mentor, and then a couple of scholars, Elena Hepe from the Netherlands. I will not attempt to pronounce that university's name. And then my old friend Janice Cooper-Smith, who's helped with many of our elements of effective practice products. All of these folks brought tremendous expertise and kind of knowledge of this field and real life experience serving folks with disabilities to this. And we can't thank them enough for their contributions to the product. So that's enough from me. I'm going to turn things over to Janelle here, who's going to walk through kind of what we cover in the introduction of the resource. There's some really good kind of initial groundwork learning in the introduction section. So Janelle, you want to take over here and explain what folks can find in there?
I sure will. So in the introduction section, we're going to set the stage, and we're going to use this as an opportunity to lay some foundation. So by the time we get to sections 2 and 3, which Kristen and Jordy will speak about and gets into the nuts and bolts of things, we have some general language and knowledge that we all can agree upon. So in the intro section, you will find a brief background on the scope of disability and youth needs. You'll find some literature review about the support that mentoring provides, the benefits to youth, pathways of change and support, and challenges in service delivery, generally and in relation to disabled youth. You'll find a call to action early on about what it takes to build a more inclusive program. And it concludes with markers of a committed approach. Next slide, please. So as we started digging into this work as co-authors and in collaboration with the working group, we realized really quickly that there's a lot of language and acronyms and words that are aligned with the disability community that others may or may not have been introduced to. And so sometimes when you're learning new concepts, it can be intimidating or confusing, or there can be misinformation or myths about certain things. So we thought we'll start with some key concepts and definitions in the guide to make sure we have that we're speaking the same language in terms of disability concepts. So you're going to find in the guide information about the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was passed in 1990, and why it was landmark legislation that protects individuals with disabilities, and what that means for you as folks who are within programs serving people with disabilities. We'll talk a lot about defining disability and how society and different industries define disability. We'll land upon the social model of disability, which is what Partners for Youth with Disabilities considers our lens for disability, and focuses on changing the environment and that reducing barriers in the environment is what leads to success versus changing the individual. You'll find more about that in the guide. We'll talk about accommodations and reasonable accommodations and break down myths around the cost and difficulty of accommodations. You'll find information about person first and identity first language. We know that sometimes there's a hesitancy about what to say, how to refer to people with disabilities. And so we'll talk about the pros and cons of person first, which is saying a person with a disability, versus identity first, which is saying disabled individual. There's no right or wrong answers, but having an idea of why each of those are used and chosen by folks is helpful. We'll move into disability etiquette, which is understanding how to communicate with and about people with disabilities. And this is something that everybody can use. It's always good, whether you're an expert or you're new to the field, to get a refresher so you can feel comfortable and confident in all kinds of settings. Next slide, please, Mike. We're also going to break down the use of universal design, which is an architectural concept, and dig into universal design for learning, which is how to design curricula, activities, events in a way that is accessible for all learners. So that's really applicable to anybody doing work with youth. We'll discuss intersectionality, which is very important because we know that individuals don't come to us with just one piece of their identity. There's multiple pieces of an individual's identity, and that intersectionality looks at how those pieces of identity can come together in terms of the discrimination and the social barriers that are faced by individuals. We'll take time to break down what is ableism. We know that ableism is discrimination of people with disabilities in favor of able-bodied individuals, but we'll talk more about the nuance around that, including internalized ableism. We'll focus on disability pride. Mentorship can deeply impact disability pride, which is feeling great about ourselves, including our disability, and understanding what disability offers for us and our resilience and the way we interact with the world. And mentoring is key to that. We'll speak about credible messengers. This isn't only applicable to the disability community, it's within many communities, but this idea of trusted individuals whom can be looked up to and related upon from communities. And then self-determination, which is a critical element in disability work, and the idea that mentors can help individuals with disabilities have control over their own lives, or understand the control that they have over their own lives. You'll find much more about the key concepts within the guide, thorough definitions and explanations and examples. I'm going to turn it over to Kristen, who's going to talk about program planning, leadership, and operations.
Thank you, Janelle. And so before really diving into the recommended practices around design and policies and staffing, we wanted to start with some initial steps and recommendations, such as getting buy-in and commitment for inclusion efforts from organizational leadership, because we know that disability inclusion really only becomes part of an organization's culture when leaders embrace it. And so if you're not in a leadership role, we highlight ways that you can share what you've learned with the organization. And if you are in a leadership role, how can your inclusive words and actions set that culture and tone for your organization and be a catalyst for change? Another starting point is assessing your current organizational climate around disability. And as Mike mentioned, there's a checklist version that is associated with the supplement. And we also offer links to organizational self-assessment. PYD has one on our learning platform that the supplement includes a link to. And that really allows you to reflect on different categories such as accessibility, communication, program policies, and that's a good starting place. It's also important to establish a baseline to understand how many individuals with disabilities are currently participating in your program, because we know that they are, but having that starting point will allow you to monitor your progress over time when you're getting started in this work. Next slide, please. We also break down policy and infrastructure self-review practices. And so really once a program's established a baseline understanding of demographics and where they're at with their disability inclusion, we offer some steps to further examine this through the lens of inclusivity. And these are practices that we recommend for all mentoring programs below, such as developing a public inclusion statement. And this is different from an anti-discrimination statement. It's really a way to communicate your organization's values and commitment to inclusion. And we offer some different examples of what those could look like to help you get started in that work. We also highlight the importance of examining and revising policies around hiring staff or managing volunteers. So thinking about how accessible your process is for each of those areas. And then we highlight strengthening policies related to bullying and harassment. We know that most programs have these policies, but it's important to ensure that they explicitly include disability as part of it. Also important to examine and ensure physical accessibility. And so within the guide, we share examples and tools for this, such as that anywhere that mentoring is happening, your headquarters, your program activities, the events that you're suggesting for mentor and mentee matches have these considerations in mind. And in addition to the physical spaces, it's also important that you're able to review your online platforms and websites. We know that these can create barriers to inclusion. And so we offer some resources for you to check these areas and build that into your programming. Next slide, please. We then dive into staffing practices, and we know that programs will have an easier time meeting the needs of youth and volunteers with disabilities if they have disabled adults on their staff and their employees have received high quality training. So proactive is a word that is used a lot in the supplement, and that proactive approach is very important in terms of committing to inclusion. We break down different areas for professional development training on these topics, such as inclusive communication, universal design for learning, understanding the ADA. So you'll have a starting point there with what you might dive into. And we know that these practices can help you get started, but in order to sustain the practices, we wanted to get into recommendations so that they continue regardless of changes of staff over time. And one area for this is to build an accessibility and accommodations budget. Although accommodations may be free or low cost, it's important to still proactively include this in the budget. And we also have included resources for better understanding what those accommodations may be and what those considerations are. And we know that no program gets all of these things right the first time. So it's important to conduct periodic and ongoing organizational assessment and policy reviews. And some of the tools that we mentioned will allow you to do that and to proactively have that self-evaluation built in. Also wanted to highlight the importance of addressing incidents of discrimination or exclusion quickly and thoroughly. And going back to the policies, that really involves making sure that your procedures have clear responsibilities, protocols, and timelines and actions that are outlined. Next slide, please. So the previous slides that I highlighted were recommendations for all programs. And while those recommendations might be helpful or are helpful to every program, we also wanted to highlight recommendations for programs that are focused on youth with disabilities explicitly. And so for those, we wanted to highlight the importance of involving mentees and mentors with disabilities in program planning. There's a common mantra, which you may have heard in the disability community, nothing about us without us. And so that phrase really highlights the importance of program planning that incorporates the perspectives of people with disabilities from all stages of planning. We also share more information on building a strong theory of change. And again, while a strong theory of change is foundational to every mentoring program, there are also some unique considerations for programs that exclusively serve youth or designed to serve youth with disabilities. And so we highlight tailoring program activities and mentor approaches to these specific needs. We give examples of different processes that lead to positive outcomes and what those could look like as you're designing your program, and then how to identify the right outcome when you're doing that process. We also recommend considering extended age range from services. And the reason that we included this is because we know that for many youth with disabilities, they often lose access to services at 22, so having an extended age range can be particularly valuable. And related to that, considering a focus on transition points, as mentors can be key in helping mentees during this time to build advocacy skills and self-determination. And then we break down different program models to consider, such as group or peer formats or online formats that might enhance outcomes. So that gives a sense of kind of the first section. And then in section 2, we offer additional practices that can be helpful around recruitment, training, and support. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Jordy to share more on those practices.
Great. Hey, Jordy, before you get going here, I want to pause and see if we have any questions from the audience. I know we just covered a lot of ground there, and I want to make sure if folks have any questions about maybe some of those key concepts that Janelle mentioned, or some of these kind of leadership and policy and kind of program infrastructure things that Kristen just talked about. So I want to just give it a minute if anyone wants to type something into the Q&A feature there. We want to make sure we get anyone's questions answered. Khadija, do we have anything waiting in there?
We do not have anything at the moment.
Okay. Great. Well, real quick, just before we move on to Jordy, I just wanted to ask maybe our experts at PYD, not to put you on the spot here, but out of all those things that we've just discussed, those key concepts, some of these bigger kind of commitments to disability inclusion work, you've worked with a lot of programs over the years. What is a common kind of pain point or challenge for many programs? Is there a particular area out of all that they tend to struggle with or need to start improvements on?
That is such a good question, Mike, and I can turn it over to Kristen too, because Kristen helps to facilitate our disability mentoring certification that's in partnership with Mentor, and we've had over 100 professionals graduate from that program. So there's a large, group that we can pull from and think through the the thematic similarities between all of them. I would say in some of the follow-up work I've done with folks who are trying to implement these practices and strategies, to me, the biggest barrier to implementation is lack of leadership buy-in. Because you can have frontline staff doing all kinds of great inclusion work, but at the end of the day, if there's not an accommodations budget or there's not a commitment to ensure accessibility of the website or ensure the accessibility of the building that you're in, then you're not going to be able to serve the individuals you in the way that you want. And so to me, thinking about how do you create that organizational buy-in at the top, and how do you communicate the why, the value of this for the organization to folks who maybe haven't considered it before. So mine is more like a wide organizational lens, but that's what I've noticed. Kristen?
I would absolutely agree with that. I think that's a really important point. And I would also say sometimes the barrier is just getting started. It can be daunting when you begin anything. And so just realizing that it's a continuous journey and you're always learning, and that's part of it. And there's a phrase we like, when you know better, do better, and just taking that attitude and mindset on this journey.
That's great.
Mike, we
Yeah,
actually got two more questions. One of them is, can you share the type of items to include in an accommodation budget line item? And the other one is, please provide an example of a public inclusion statement.
I can answer that. So let me start with the public inclusion statement. This one's a little bit easier. If you go to our website, which is pyd.org, we have an inclusion statement, and an inclusion statement is talking about the proactive way you are committed to including everybody. That's different, as Kristen said, than a non-discrimination statement, which focuses on what you won't do. It's a more positive, proactive approach to your commitment. We also have a course on PYD's online learning network, which Kristen or Jordy could pop in the chat, that is specifically walks you through how to create an inclusion statement. It's not a challenging process, but it does take time because it involves everybody coming together and agreeing on the values. Like, what do we want this to look like and how do we want to commit? So it's a great first step, because you can't do an inclusion statement without all levels of the organization, including leadership, including direct service. So it's a nice, if you don't know where to start, that's a good place to start. The second thing on an accommodations budget, I would say that can be anything from very inexpensive things like having fidget toys available, having a higher up desk that could fit a wheelchair underneath it for a student who needs that. It could be low cost things. It could be free things like extra time or having a timer set for transition times. And it could be a more expensive thing like a piece of software or American Sign Language interpreter. The most important thing is that you think about that budget ahead of time before your fiscal year starts, because if you're asking for money that's not in the budget, it's too easy to receive a no, and that's not the answer we want. If we know that there's a centralized accommodations budget and a program director can go and ask for an accommodation, whether that's a $25 cost or several $100s, then you know that you have a commitment to include a wide number of youth. In the guide that we're talking about today, there's a section on accommodations, which might help break that down even more clearly for you.
Great, thanks, Janelle. So I think if folks have other questions as we go, just put them into that Q&A panel. Those were two excellent questions, so thank you for asking those. And I believe in the guide, we also include mentors inclusion statement, which I'm pretty sure PYD helped us write a few years ago anyway. So there's a couple examples in there, but the PYD site has that little tutorial on kind of what to include and kind of how to phrase those things. So I want to turn things over to Jordy here to lead us through kind of the rest of the recommendations in the guide. These get more at kind of the actual running of the program and the things that your frontline staff can do to make this happen as well. So take it away, Jordy.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mike. The best way to kind of summarize and going into these sections is, as we've mentioned, like these are really the headlines, not so much as the details. And some of these may be more applicable to your organization just based on where you're at and what your focus is. You might be a group mentoring, you might be one-to-one mentoring, you might be entirely virtual mentoring, you may not even have mentoring, but this might be an aspect to kind of explore if you're looking to implement some forms of mentoring. And really it goes by step. If you've seen the elements of effective practice already, these might be steps that you're quite familiar with, but we're providing the lens of disability inclusion so that you at least know a direction to take when you're putting together your plan. And it all starts with recruitment. So as we mentioned before, especially as you're creating a budget for accessibility in your planning, make sure that all your websites and web content is aligning to the web content and to accessibility guidelines. Essentially, is it viewable on a screen reader? Is there ways for folks to have like oral narration if like they are, if they're deaf and can't or if they're blind and need to understand a little bit more what's on the content? Ensure that youth and adults with disabilities are represented in recruitment materials. So this is very key because if you're not showing disability in your marketing materials, then folks with disabilities will not feel welcome coming into your program. And it's important that it's not just focused on white disability, but including Black disabled folks, Indigenous disabled folks, really encompassing that you are open to anyone with a disability. This also includes really having a robust plan for formats and distributing your recruitment materials. Some disabled youth may prefer just finding things online, but when you're thinking about the broader community, you also may want to consider how other formats, whether that's physical. A lot of youth that we work with often still prefer physical. They may still have fax machines. And so think about the variety of ways that you need to set aside. This also includes having products available in Braille, especially if you're working with the blind and low vision community, or large print as well. These are things that are important to make sure that you're reaching a broad audience as possible. This can also be done by just partnering with local organizations who can help recruitment of participants with disabilities. Find disabled owned or disability focused organizations. The best places that we work with at PYD include the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, the Autistic Women and Non-Binary Network, SINS Invalid. A lot of these organizations that have been staples in talking about disability justice, especially within the larger communities that your youth will be serving, and provide you the language to help reach a large audience of folks with disabilities. And definitely an emphasis on the recruitment of mentors as well as hiring of staff who have prior experience working with disabilities. Just because you hire someone who has a disability, that's just one disability. So really think about the different ways, because while shared experience is one thing, shared values and a shared lived experience might be different, especially if you're thinking about if you're serving a local community. If you're specifically serving the Boston area, what's it like having a disability living in Boston? Next slide, please. So now you've recruited. So the next big part that can often have a lot of ups and downs depending on how you're going about it is participant screening and acceptance. And this will look differently depending on if you're screening mentors versus if you're screening youth. You probably may not be screening youth, but it still be a part of the program itself and how you're bringing youth and mentors into the program. The biggest thing to think about is you want to gather as much information about someone's disability and strengths, as well as weaknesses, things that they might need support with, and goals. and helping them figure out how you can best accommodate them into the program. I will be very frank in saying that I work with a lot of youth who do not self-identify as having a disability. They may not even know that they have a disability. It could potentially be a trigger for them. And while you're wanting to create a space that really focuses on disability pride, there also needs to be an understanding that you want to give folks and honor and validate their own authentic experience. They may not be at that level just yet. And it's really important to get to what their level. Only a disabled person knows what their story is and who they are. And as part of being an accomplice to them, it goes into really aligning with how they want their story and their lived experience to be presented in the program. And that might mean, instead of asking, well, what's your disability like? Asking, well, what would you need if you're going out in the community? What would you need if you're meeting a mentor in your apartment? Really kind of fixing the language so that you have different and plain language ways to ask for this information to best find them a suitable match. Provide scenarios, especially when you're screening mentors. It's the unspoken truth that maybe a lot of mentors aren't necessarily coming in to your program because they want to form a meaningful relationship. We know that there is a lot of white saviorism in mentoring and a lot of bias with mentors wanting to do this for gratitude and recognition, and may possess harmful biases or prejudice. And that's why you have the screening process for. It's important to figure out that you're getting the quality mentors as opposed to bringing in all the mentors, because you're looking to create a meaningful match that's ultimately going to impact the youth that you serve. Provide scenarios and keep assessing where a mentor is at in terms of what they know about disability, what they understand about anti-racism, what they understand about sexuality and in the queer community when it comes to the intersection of disability. Talk about anti-bullying and inclusion practices. Make sure that there's a commitment that they're signing or an agreement or setting the ground rules of what you as the program expect and what will be expected as them as a mentor. This final point is the biggest thing that I feel like a lot of mentoring programs need to really consider. If your youth does not want to have a mentor and there is no buy-in, you've lost that battle. If you're looking to help match a youth and really get them involved in the program, there has to be their buy-in and their consent. Often it's difficult to be in a situation where you can't overstep a parent or legal guardian's authority, especially if they are that bent on wanting to have a mentor in their youth's life. But ultimately, you're serving the youth. And if there is no buy-in, if a youth is not really able to put in their foot forward and wanting to be in this relationship, it's not going to work for the youth, and it's especially not going to work for the mentor. So you want to make sure that a youth's consent is given and they want to be matched and have a mentor. I know that we want to serve every single youth that we can coming into our program, especially given the need of mentors, but that can be just as key in ensuring that both the youth and the mentor are walking away with a satisfactory experience. Next slide, please. Obviously, training is always going to be a constant within programs. There is going to be a commitment from both youth and mentors that they are not just agreeing to a match, but they're agreeing to continuing education and training. I know for a lot of mentoring programs, there's often the once mandatory training that how we get mentors into the program and onboarded, but it's important to keep providing different types of training for them so that they can keep being involved, so they can have that long-lasting engagement. Always ask for accommodations during training. Do they prefer training to be more hybrid? Do they need breaks? Is there something that they need to process the information better? Make sure that you're also not just focusing on topics regarding mentoring, but also specific training topics that will talk about the disability community. For example, we are going to be starting in March with my colleague Athena, our mentor community forum, which will be webinars that will happen throughout the year that will revolve around a specific topic around disability and mentoring. And we have one coming up on voters' rights in the ADA as well. And that could be important, especially if mentors are learning about the history of disability in the United States and abroad. always have some form of self-assessment and awareness and bias during any mentor training. Again, these don't have to be all focused on mentoring as a practice itself, but talking a lot about like anti-racism, the history of the queer community and its intersection with disabilities. Maybe talking about how to support positive behavior, maybe having trainings around self-harm and suicide prevention. These are things that are all go hand in hand with providing a positive mentoring experience. And while mentors tend to be the first thing we talk about when we think about participant training, there should also be training available for youth and especially to parents. When we think about it, there's always going to be a nature versus nurture impact coming in, especially if you're trying to figure out where a parent is at in trying to support their youth with a disability, especially since we're there to serve the youth and we want to make sure that their family has access to the same training and materials so they know what to expect coming into the program. Next slide, please. As being in the PYD for 5 years, matching can tend to be where a lot of serious conversations have to take place, especially when you're thinking about making sure that the relationship is amicable, both on the youth and mentor side. When you're looking at matching, you need to look at the preferences of the mentee. Sometimes a mentee may not want to be matched with someone that has a same disability. I've had matches that had a lot of issues where I've had a mentor and a mentee that were both autistic and it may not have worked for them. That may not be the sign of the disability, but it's also more about compatibility. A lot of mentees would rather have a mentor that has a more shared value in addition to shared identity. So really focusing on how those two things coalesce when you're thinking about the matching process to the best degree as possible even. What is a mentee really looking for? It's important that at PYD that we match on a best fit model because we know that if we just create a match on the spot, it may not always be the best match. And so we always want to provide organic ways for prospective youth and mentors to meet each other. So maybe we can see that could be a match right there that maybe we didn't consider. Also think about transportation issues. Think about the logistical factors of how a mentor and a mentee are going to meet up. If you have a mentor, for example, that lives outside of your service area, but says like, I can make it in, you want to ensure that they're willing to transport themselves to meet their mentee and you're in their service area, as well as make sure that you understand if a mentee is able to take transit on their own, if they need assistance, maybe they have a preference for a mentor with a car. And then in addition, always make sure that you're honoring confidentiality and making sure a disclosure when creating a match is kept intact, especially when you're getting information about their disability and see what a mentee and a mentor is comfortable sharing in advance. And sometimes there has to be boundaries around that as well. Sometimes mentors want to know every single thing about the disability, but again, it's going to be a unique experience. If you've met one person with a disability, you've met one person with a disability. Next slide, please. And then one of the biggest factors that to work with your program and your staffing on is how are we supporting the relationships? You want to make sure that there is a consistent routine of your program staff connecting with mentors and mentees, as well as mentors and mentees knowing that there is an expectation for them to respond and follow through with those check-ins. I always like to say as like my ongoing joke, it may not always be funny if I say it a lot, but I say that I'm not a mind reader. I wish I could be, but I'm not. But if I'm working with 75 active matches in the program, I'm not going to know what's really going on unless they tell me. So it's important that you set those expectations up front that you will be checking in on those matches and that they will be expected to follow through. Again, always make sure that there's an accommodation that's being honored or met, especially when you're conducting check-ins. Make sure that you're also sharing opportunities about upcoming events, activities, group outings, field trips. A lot of mentors have always asked me, I want to meet with other matches or I want to meet with other mentors so I can maybe ask them for their advice on something. Always share like what's coming up because that can provide different opportunities for matches to engage with each other and engage with the program. And then always make sure that there's ongoing learning activities, trainings, and especially referrals that support disabled mentors and mentees in their personal and professional lives. If a match is going really, really well, a mentor may say, hey, I have a friend, or a mentee will be like, hey, I know someone that's also looking for a mentor. And having those quality relationships will mean having more quality matches that might be coming to your program. Next slide. And then to kind of really close things off is obviously the topic of how do we close a match off? It's great and definitely something a program should look at if a match is going to be a long term. You obviously want that longevity as the goal of the program, but closure and program exit is bound to be expected. And this is what we always say at PYD, closure is a policy, it is not a stage. If a closure is not done in a responsible way, both from the program and on the mentors and mentees side, it is going to lead to not the outcomes that you, the mentor and the mentee, were expecting. Closure is something that takes time. It is a transition, and a lot of youth need that emotional support and time to process that transition. And so you want to prepare mentors and mentees with that expectation of what they need to do to best prepare for a closure and program exit, as well as find continuing ways for them to engage. Obviously for youth, it's obviously the prospect of potentially rematching them, but maybe there's other programs that they can look at in the interim. And then for the program evaluation piece, I'm going to hand this over to Mike as we kind of tie things up all together to really talk about how these things will impact your program, especially as you think about including youth with disabilities in your programming.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jordy. And yeah, I'll cover the program evaluation pieces here quickly. I do want to note for folks that are kind of familiar with the elements of effective practice, you'll notice that a lot of the advice here kind of mirrors what you find in just the general guidance we already provide in the elements publication. But what we wanted to do here was really kind of emphasize certain things for young people with disabilities. And it's a kind of a good example of that universal design concept, in that, you know, yes, young people with disabilities may need a little bit more of a runway to the closure time, right? They may need a little extra preparation. It may be harder for them to schedule goodbye meetings for logistical and transportation reasons. But if you design this in a way that it meets their needs, it's going to meet the needs of every other young person that you're serving as well. They all can benefit from a little bit more of a ramp up to that closure time. It's a time of stress for every match, right? And so I'm hopeful that folks kind of saw a thread of like, hey, if we make this improvement to better serve youth with disabilities, this will lead to some stronger programming across the board for every kid we serve. Quickly on the program evaluation side of things, we did want to provide a little bit of guidance around this final kind of task, if you will, of running a program. Certainly a lot of this is around just providing those same accommodations for those with disabilities. I know that can be hard. Many, the advice generally is, collect data the same way from everybody, but there are times when people with disabilities would prefer to give verbal answers or don't want to fill it out online. And so having a little bit of flexibility and creativity will help ensure that their voices are heard. I'd rather collect data a different way and get their voices as part of my evaluation rather than having them not fill out, say, my online survey form, and then I don't have their perspectives at all in my evaluation. Kind of to that point, I think there's a good history of qualitative evaluation around programs that are serving youth with disabilities, getting their stories, getting their voices into it. To me, that is as meaningful as anything you could prove statistically about the power of mentoring. So make sure as you're evaluating, get their stories, talk to them, learn what the experience has been like, both good and bad in your program, right? You will not know what to improve about serving these young people well if you're not asking them, how did it go? Measuring relationship quality with an inclusivity lens. Simply put, We often encourage programs to kind of look at match quality, but they'll ask about things like, do you trust your mentor? Do you like spending time with them? Do you work together to figure out activities? I rarely see those types of questionnaires asking about like, hey, is your mentor like honoring your disability and accommodations? And, Janelle mentioned that disability etiquette earlier. The mentor you might have a good relationship, but on that particular issue, there might be some things they're doing that are rubbing the mentee or their family the wrong way, right? And so really including that as part of your view of relationship quality. And then also incorporating the perspectives of others. Once again, this is kind of a general evaluation guideline, but I think it can be particularly important here. It may be challenging for a young person with a disability to kind of fully articulate what they're getting out of it, but their parents or caregivers might see a whole bunch of change and a whole bunch of positive stuff out of it. They might also be benefiting themselves from the fact that their child is being mentored. So I really encourage folks to kind of tell a holistic story and get the perspectives of caregivers and others that are in that young person's life to help round out the evaluation story. So there's more detail in the full publication, but we wanted to give a little bit of advice around that as well. So we've got a few minutes left here. We'll end at the top of the hour. I know that we had a good question come in early when you were talking, Jordy, so maybe I'll have you start in answering this. Morgan says, my organization has youth with disabilities, but we lack mentors with disabilities. Do you have suggestions on the recruitment of disabled mentors? I mean, we talked about some general things like representation in your materials and whatnot, but if you had to go out into your community and find folks with disabilities specifically to kind of come into the program, what might you start with?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good question. I see someone in the chat mentioned centers for independent living, especially if you have connections to your local branch, and basically finding whatever local disability owned or disability focused business might be willing to partner with you. And again, it all comes down to how you're marketing your program. If folks aren't seeing themselves represented on those marketing materials, then they may not feel welcomed. And also, I would even take it as an intergenerational approach. If you have had a mentee who's now an alum, who's had great success in the program, maybe offer an opportunity to have them mentor with the program. There is nothing that's more impactful than having a mentee become a mentor and having it be like an intergenerational match and highlighting that in your program. It also just means going out into the community, learning a little bit more about, who is coming to a lot of your events that may have connections to various businesses. It's not just posting online, but maybe looking at Facebook groups that have like folks with disabilities. I know that in Boston, we have the Disability Exchange Boston group. So you can promote events and see if you can get mentors with disabilities to come to your program there.
Great. Thanks, Jordy.
Mike, I have one more quick idea on that. Every
Sure.
college, whether it's a community college or a four-year university, has a disability or accessible services office. That's a great place to connect with young adults with disabilities who might, be great at mentorship. Folks, especially who are at the, who are getting ready to graduate, and every college has one of those, and that's an easy connection to make.
Great. Thank you, Janelle. We did have another question. Paul asked, is there a certificate of attendance or anything similar from today's event? We don't generally do those, Paul, but if you need to convince your boss that this was an hour well spent out of your day, I can certainly give you an email or confirm your attendance. But for folks that are interested in kind of certification around this or going deeper on this topic, I do want to give Janelle a chance for you to just talk real quick about the trainings. We mentioned them early on that PYD does. And there's been some stuff through Mentor where we actually give programs that have gone through your training a little bit of a certification in our mentoring connector database for folks that are looking for a volunteer opportunity. So Janelle, do you want to just quickly explain what that training is all about?
I sure will. We are taking signups for our next cohort of the Disability Mentoring Certification Program. As I mentioned before, we've had over 100, it might be 150 now, graduates of that program from around the country. It's a 16-week deep dive orientation to all of the things that we've been talking about. For those who have done that program, we also offer a Summer Institute, which is an advanced course that works on implementation. So I see Jordy put our Learn website on. Perhaps if Kristen can grab the link to the signups for the DMC, I will post it on there. Kristen says, I see some DMC grads on this webinar, so shout out to all of them. We are in communication with Mentor right now about building upon our existing partnership. And the goal is to continue to be able to provide all of this training and certification on a regular basis. And then if you're coming to the summit, which I know many of you will, our team will be there. Kristen will be doing a presentation. Kristen, do you want to share what day and time so folks can look for it on the agenda?
So it's going to be on Thursday morning, the first session, and we'll highlight the disability mentoring certification if you're interested in learning more about that.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Thanks to our audience for joining us today. We'll include these links when we send out a final email to everyone who registered today, but really big thank you to the Partners for the Youth with Disabilities group. You've been amazing to work with, and it's been a real pleasure to put together this guidance for mentoring programs. I encourage folks to go download the publication and the checklist. And if you've got other questions or want more training, our folks at PYD here have a lot of good things in store, as we just mentioned. So thank you everyone for joining us today, and be well and happy mentoring month. And we'll see you next time. Take care. Bye, everyone.
Hi, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Hi, thank you.